I'm going to talk to you today about why I think the biodiversity crisis is just as important, even more important than the climate crisis. And I'm going to start it by looking here at looking at this picture here, which why is this not? Oh, there it goes. Which I know we all know. We've all seen this one before, and and right now we think about it as the most important thing that we're doing to it is changing the climate. And everyone goes around and says, "Oh, climate, 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 climate's the same thing as as the same thing as sustainability." And in fact, there's nothing special about having a climate. There's nothing special about having a climate. Every planet has a climate, and every planet has elements or building blocks, Lego blocks, if you will, that are left over from the Big Bang. What's unique about this planet is, in fact, the fact that it has life. We don't know what life is, but we know what it does. And what does it do? It moves around, it transports and it transforms those Lego blocks or those elements, those non-living things that are left over from the Big Bang. And every time it's been possible to get enough free energy out of such a transformation, then an organism or an organism group has evolved to do that job. For the last something like 3.5 billion years, it's been the interaction between life, the biosphere, all living organisms, and the geosphere, which is the climate, which is the energy balance. I mean, climate is nothing more than how much heat energy do we get from the sun? How much is stored near the surface of the planet? How does it move around? What does it get into contact with? So it's been the interaction between life and the energy balance and these non-living materials here on Earth that have created the conditions on Earth. And when you think of it, if something major happened either in the biosphere or in the geosphere, in the biosphere, if you think of when photosynthesis evolved and we got oxygen in the atmosphere and an ozone layer that made it possible for multi-celled organisms to be on land, or when we got green plants, that also totally changed the conditions on Earth because you could store carbon in plants and not in the atmosphere. Same thing in the geosphere. When the dinosaurs got a meteor on their head that changed the energy balance 66 million years ago, totally changed conditions on Earth. Tectonic plates moving around totally changed conditions on Earth. So when something major happens between the biosphere and either the biosphere or the geosphere, you can totally change the conditions on Earth. But often, these two spheres get into a kind of a quasi-equilibrium, and then the conditions are very stable on Earth. And that's what's happened for the last 12,000 years on Earth. Last 12,000 years where everything we associate with modern civilization evolved. Our species has been here for something like 250,000 years in our present biological form. So there was no reason why we shouldn't have had advanced civilization before we did, no biological reason, but many anthropologists believe the conditions weren't right. And it's the stability that the Earth has offered the last 12,000 years that has given us the opportunity to develop into the societies that we have. Now, and that, of course, because it's the interaction between the biosphere and the geosphere that creates conditions on this planet, it means that the biodiversity crisis must be at least as important as the climate crisis. And I have to say that the biodiversity crisis worries me more than the climate crisis, because when we get control over our emissions, and I say when, because we do have all the technologies that we need. We haven't made them pay yet, but we can do it. We could do it if we wanted to do it. And when we do it, we will end in a situation where the Earth's energy balance it's like thousands of years, but it will go back to one that it doesn't have a human fingerprint on it. But every time we lose a species, it's gone forever. And that scares me. Now, in the last 150 years or so, there's been another force that can change the overall conditions on Earth, and that, of course, is us, what we call the anthroposphere. And when we talk about the Anthropocene, it's simply the time of humans. It means that we recognize, we acknowledge that we can change the conditions on Earth, but we don't do it directly. We do it through changing either the biosphere or the geosphere. Now, in our planetary boundaries work, we need to manage our relationship with the planet. We recognize that in the planetary boundaries, and we say, if we want to manage our relationship, what are the processes that we need to manage? What interactions do we need to manage on this planet? And we identify 9 different processes happening in our ecosystem, which is the whole Earth. I mean, an ecosystem is defined as a group of organisms in contact with each other in a physical environment. And the global market means we are in contact with every other human and every other living organism on this planet. So the planet is our ecosystem. And we identify 9 different things that we're pushing on this planet, the most important being biosphere integrity. And I don't say biodiversity because it's not just the diversity that's important, but biosphere integrity, changes in life and climate. Those are the 2 core boundaries. And all of the other 7, which can be felling of forest, it can be use of fresh water, it can be pollution, all of those operate either through affecting the biodiversity, biosphere integrity, or through affecting the energy balance, climate or ozone layer, and so on. So the 2 core boundaries are biosphere integrity and climate because of this interaction thing. Interestingly, 3 of these are all about what we take out of the planet. Every organism survives by taking something out of the planet, so that's not a problem at all. But these 3, biosphere integrity, we do take fish directly. We do fell forests to make agricultural land and so on. Land system, the use of fresh water and so on. That's where we're taking things out of the environment to survive. All of the other 7 have to do with waste. And it's interesting because nature doesn't produce waste. We produce waste. The newest planetary boundaries report, which came a year ago now, and interestingly enough has been downloaded about 500,000 times, showed that we're on the wrong side of the boundary for 6 of the 9 processes that we identify. That doesn't actually worry me so much because in the 1990s, we were on the wrong side of the boundary when it came to ozone depletion, or very close to it at least. And now we're safely in the safe operating space. So being on the wrong side in itself isn't a problem. But what scares me is the fact that we did an update in 2015, and all of the ones that were transgressed in 2015 are more transgressed today than they were in 2015, which basically says, as we sit here looking at each other, the pressure, the human pressure on our ecosystem is increasing. Now, since this is all about biodiversity, let's go in and look at what we say about biodiversity. First of all, we say there are 2 metrics, and one of the metrics is diversity. It is species. It is the genetic diversity, because it's this diversity that has given life the resilience to be able to operate under different climate conditions, and the Earth has had different climate conditions in the last 3.5 billion years. So diversity is exceedingly important for the resilience in life. But when we talk about interacting with the with CO2 or whatever, with elements, then it's the combination. It's the relative abundance of life, different life forms as well. So we say we need we need another metric. It's not just about looking at species. We also need to look at function. And we choose to look at function. We choose to look at carbon and how life moves carbon around, because carbon is the backbone of life, and our changing of the carbon cycle is also the cause, the major cause of climate change. And so what we do is we go in and say, okay, for terrestrial biodiversity, and this only works for terrestrial biodiversity, but for terrestrial biodiversity, it's photosynthesis, which is providing the energy for life on Earth. And we arrive at the conclusion, we look at how much photosynthesis was there on land in the 10,000 years before the Industrial Revolution. Turns out it was incredibly stable because the conditions on Earth were very, very stable. As I say, that's what characterizes this period of the Holocene. It now turns out, if you look at how much we're using, we are taking a third of the energy that was historically available to nature. And since it's this primary production, which is the energy supporting biodiversity, this has to be a major driver of the loss of biodiversity on land. And of course, we're taking it by, first of all, putting in buildings and infrastructure where there isn't any photosynthesis anymore. And then we're doing our own agriculture, which does not increase photosynthesis. Think of a barley field. It's green only from March or April until July. And we do everything we possibly can to make sure there are no other plants that come in and do photosynthesis there. Of course, you'll say to me there's more photosynthesis today than there was at the time of the Industrial Revolution. And that's true because we put more CO2 into the atmosphere. But that extra photosynthesis is buffering climate change. We can't harvest and use that because then climate change would be so much worse. So the important message here, we say, is that the primary production, just thinking about it thermodynamically on this planet, in our ecosystem, the primary production or biomass that we're taking can't be used by nature. So we need to be looking at some of the drivers, not just looking at red listed species and how can we put a fence around them and how can we make sure that people don't disturb the birds that are nesting here. We need to be looking at the drivers of how we're losing biodiversity. And certainly use of biomass or use of land is a driver. In fact, if you look at the IPBES data, and this is a paper that came out using IPBES data in 22, on the left-hand side, you see what are the drivers, what's the ranking of the drivers globally in terms of loss of biodiversity. And the most important is land and sea use, where direct exploitation comes in very, very close. Climate change comes in a third place, pollution fourth, and invasive species last. But if you look to the right, you see that it's very different. On land, it is just like totally, I mean, the absolutely most important driver is land use change, which could also be interpreted as being the biomass, the loss of energy for them. Whereas in the ocean, it's direct exploitation, but climate change following much, much closer. So climate change is a much greater influence on biodiversity in the ocean than it is on land. Hardly surprising when over 90% of the extra energy that's being stored near the surface of this planet is in the ocean and causing climate change. So my message here is really address the drivers. And how can we address the drivers? Well, here, oops, I'm sorry. That was, oh, damn. Anyway, this slide wasn't set up properly. The driver, what's supposed to happen here is on the right-hand side, we show that all of the goals that make people more, that we have a better well-being, we get richer, they all come with costs from biodiversity and climate. And right now, those goals are going down, the biodiversity and the climate, whereas the others are going up. This is a zero-sum game. You can party even though your bank account's going down. You just can't party forever. And that's the situation that humanity has brought itself into. You'll note that some of the goals aren't actually here. And the rest of the goals can all be linked under or put under one of the four levers we have in society to address climate change and biodiversity loss. And those four drivers are technology, but it's not going to do it on its own. Technology can't make biodiversity. It can't make energy. It is our behavior. Nothing can be sustainable on its own. It's our behavior. And we can control our behavior, at least to some degree, using the legal system or the government system, but also the economic system. And that's where I wanted to finish with two examples of what we're doing here in Denmark, of looking at putting taxes on pesticides and putting taxes, actually, this is in Danish, but the part down below here says there will be a complete change in how we use our land area in Denmark, and a tax on greenhouse gases from animals and animal production. So we need to be addressing the drivers, and to do that, we need to use our regulatory, our governance system, and our economic system. Thank you, and I'm sorry that slide wasn't as it was supposed to be.